Good afternoon and welcome to episode 24 of International Expansion Explained. My guest today is Alexandra Stefanov, and she is a China observer with a real passion for digital trends and innovation, as well as being the co-author of the book Digitalisation Made in China, how China is going to manage and transform economy, trade, and marketing with AI and tools. Her background in Chinese and transcultural studies, I can't even read today, and extensive stays in China, Alexandra has been devoting her attention to the topics of China, digital trends, innovations, and internet culture for the last more than 10 years. On her platform China Impulse and in her podcast China Impulse, Zukunftstrends aus dem Reich der Mitte, she offers practical advice and knowledge, tips, as well as inspiration from China's digital world. Asia is ahead of Europe by at least 5 years in most digital trends, so her aim with China Impulse is to give you an overview of the Chinese digital world and a better understanding of the digital mindset behind it in order to better plan and shape your future. Right now, as if that isn't enough, she's also doing a PhD at the University of Marburg on the subject of German-Chinese automotive industry, focusing on software and global supply chains. Welcome. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me here, Catherine, and thank you for the wonderful introduction.
Yeah, I'm just hoping if somebody could maybe give us a hello or drop us a comment on LinkedIn, just so that we know that we are actually live and that there are some people out there, that would reassure me that the technical stuff is all working. But yeah, maybe you could start by giving us a quick overview. How did you decide to study Chinese, and describe a little bit how you arrived at the point that you're at today? What was the journey that you had?
Yes, I will try to keep it short. So my my China journey started actually with the language, because I've always loved to learn new languages. And at some point I got a little bit bored of the usual European languages, English, Spanish, English, Spanish, Italian, what we learned here. And I thought I would like to learn something that is a little bit more challenging. And that's how I came to learn Chinese first a little bit, and then study it at University in Heidelberg. And I enjoyed it so much, with all the facets and aspects that China has that are so different to our, let's say, so-called Western mindset, that that's how I started with my first trips to China, the first insights I got into China. And I noticed that I was interested in the tradition and culture as well, but I found it even more fascinating how modern China looks like and works like, and how things are happening extremely fast, how technology is taking over everyday life. I went to China in 2008, the first time, and nothing was digitalized. I didn't have a smartphone. Everything was completely different compared to today. And I just found it fascinating how that is developing. And that's how I started to concern myself with these topics. I worked in event management for a while after my studies, but then when the pandemic came, it was actually kind of an opportunity for me to not organize the events anymore, as they were not possible at the time, and rather focus on my personal projects, which was the start of China Impulse, what I am doing today, showing digital trends and the implication of technologies in China.
Wow, cool. Yeah, and 2008 China was an exciting place at that time. You could feel that energy. That was also the time when I first visited China, but it certainly wasn't digital in the way that the West was. Or, coming from Europe, China didn't feel as advanced in that kind of digital way. Not like it would do now, where you feel like you're going forward in time when you move into China. But you've made it your mission, really, to bring the digital trends that we both know from China closer to Europeans, especially to Germany. So maybe we could move into our topic today a little bit by outlining the obvious outer signs of China's obsession, let's say, with all things digital.
Yes, I would say the basic requirement for the acceptance of all digital applications and everything that has happened in the last few years in China is based on the public's acceptance of new technologies. China is very fast moving. It has changed extremely over the last 40 years. So the generations that we have now have experienced so much change and so much rise in their living standards that they are more prone to accept changes, and they are much more ready to adapt to things that are developing in the country. So I would say that this openness and also this willingness to take risks, to try out new things, this strong affinity for technology, and this curiosity to try out unknown products, in this case, digital products, digital services, this is something that is the basic fundament of what has happened in China over the last couple of decades, and especially over the last couple of years. And we can see that China is one of the few mobile-only countries. We talk a lot about mobile first here in Germany at the moment, but China is really mobile-only. So we see that a lot of Chinese people are not using laptops or desktop computers anymore, and they're doing everything on their smartphones. Yeah. And I would say one reason for that is that China has largely skipped this age of desktops, and they switched from more or less offline to immediately being online on mobile phones and at some point on smartphones. While here in Germany, we still have this, let's say, tradition of using the internet on desktop computers. And now it's maybe a little bit slower and harder for us to switch to mobile or to smartphones, as we have gotten used to this user experience on laptops, on computers. And that is one of the basic things that are happening in China, why people are so digital and so mobile. And also this, what I mentioned before, that they are open-minded and they trust technologies rather than seeing them as dangerous or as seeing the worst case scenario in everything that is emerging as a new technology or a new application.
And I guess it's that question of convenience, isn't it? Because so many Chinese professionals are living in really huge megacities that it's really hard for Europeans to imagine just how big Shanghai or Chongqing, how big those cities really are, and how much time you actually can spend every day getting from home to your workplace and to wherever else that you need to go to do your daily errands. And so anything that can make your life that bit more convenient is something that's welcomed, isn't it?
Exactly. And should I say a little bit about this? Because what came to mind when you mentioned this is I really like the expression that was kind of coined by Dr. Hannes Jedek. I read one of his articles and I saw a couple of his presentations where he calls this the convenience society. And I think that is such an interesting and very well put term for what is happening in society in China right now. Exactly what you mentioned, that people value everything that is easily integrated in their everyday life, that is convenient, that is fangbian, as you would say in Chinese. So everything that is comfortable. And I think that is a big part of this as well, like as you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not only China who's affected by this. I see similar trends also with friends in Korea, but I think that China is affected by it as a society in a huge way, simply because also there's that factor that outside of the big cities, then often it's been really difficult for people to buy things. For example, there's not such a choice of, you can't buy everything in every store, and so it made it easier for people to buy things online that they potentially otherwise couldn't have access to in quite such an easy way without traveling a really long way to get things. So yeah, it's always quite interesting to me. I remember when my friends said, oh, we have this new app, you have to try it, it's really good fun, and they kind of like, and in the middle of we're sitting in a conference room and they were like, no, you have to download it now. So they're sitting in the conference room, and it was at the time when WeChat was really just taking off, and when this question of shake your phone and whoever is a WeChat user in the vicinity, you can see who's using it. Well, of course, you wouldn't do that in China now because every phone in the area would be like a WeChat user. But at that time, we were in a conference room with about 10 people. And so I immediately had like 10 WeChat contacts. And if you just imagine the scene of 10 professionals sitting in a conference room and everybody is shaking their phones because, yeah.
Because why not, right?
Yeah,
And we
because why
always
not?
and we always ask ourselves what could be the downsides here, or what could be dangerous about it, or should we use it? Is it even useful? And I always have the experience that in China they just try it, and maybe it's not useful, but at least they find out.
Yeah. And this idea that you do this and you're already connected with somebody, and you don't have to try to, you don't have to try to connect it in a very good way, or you don't have to be very clever in using your phone. You can just connect with people. And I think that people also saw that it was a fun factor. Serious business guys were suddenly like, oh, we can have the WeChat, and we can use all these cute stickers and whatever we need to have. So yeah, it was quite a fun opportunity. It seems like we're missing our comment stream. I know that Manfred is listening to us, but for some reason the comments are not coming through to restream. I have no idea why, but I know that he can hear us, so that's the main thing. I mean, when I quite often check on Reddit, the Travel China subreddit, and one of the like frequently asked questions, it comes up like several times a day, is how people can pay in China, because they've heard that they absolutely can't use cash under any circumstances. I mean, that's a little bit of an urban myth that you can't use cash at all. But for sure, China's a lot closer to a cashless society than Germany. Why do you think that the Chinese were so willing to use their digital wallets as much? Because it means also that the money is easier to track, doesn't it? Because China was very much a cash society in 2008, 2009. Oh, now we can see Manfred. 2008, 2009. I remember taking a group of Chinese into Kaufland, quite close to Pfaffenhofen in Germany, and they bought literally trolley. They blocked every till with trolley loads of stuff, and they wanted to pay with 500 euro notes. And they were quite surprised that they couldn't pay with a 500 euro note, because all the cashiers were worried that they could be fakes. Now, I think most Chinese wouldn't carry cash with them. How was your last visit?
So I actually agree that in many places it's not really easy to pay with cash anymore. And of course, we're talking a lot about the big cities. As soon as you go out a bit, it's a different story.
Yeah.
But in the big cities, I was using WeChat Pay and Alipay, and I was happy that they worked for me most of the time. But there's a big difference between how they work for the locals, the local Chinese versions, and how they work for us foreigners, right? Because for the Chinese, it seems to be working really well all the time, and they have no problems in paying with WeChat or Alipay. They can use both, and they can use them for anything that applies to everyday life. So whether it's just ordering something to pay for it, whether it's giving alms to beggars or whatever. But I had the experience that, first of all, I was there with the business delegation. So some people had not downloaded WeChat Pay or Alipay, and they were trying to pay with cash. And it was not always working. Taxi drivers were very reluctant to take passengers who did not have the applications to pay digitally. And even in some shops, even though there are regulations given by the government that every shop is supposed to be able to hand out change and to accept cash, also for older Chinese people who might not want to use the digital payments, I still had the experience that a lot of shops did not have change. So they said, okay, I can try to figure out how to give you change for your 100 yuan bill, but I don't have it right now here. So the easiest and most convenient thing was for, let's say, me to pay for that person and say, we'll just figure it out afterwards, because it's a haggle to just try to find someone who actually has change on them and who is still in this cash society, let's say. But of course, we're talking a lot about the big cities, right? So there, everyone is so busy and so stressed that they are just valuing this digital payment so much.
Yeah, I mean, what I did hear though is that because not even last time I was in China, but the first time I visited China last year, because it was just before WeChat introduced that we could directly connect credit cards. And for some reason, I couldn't connect my phone number. I have a very long phone number and Alipay wouldn't accept my phone number. So I took an old phone, put a Chinese SIM on it, and had Alipay on a Chinese SIM for the duration of my visit, which meant, of course, that I had full functionality, and I could make all of these kind of peer-to-peer payments, which I think that that's something that sometimes foreigners have problems with if they're not using it on a Chinese number, because often a taxi driver is looking for that kind of peer-to-peer payment, and they don't always work if you're on a foreign number, I think. But last time I visited, I only used WeChat Pay and it worked fine. So
yeah, I sometimes had the problem that randomly in some shops where I had paid before with, let's say, WeChat Pay, that it suddenly didn't work for certain payments anymore. And sometimes it would connect it to the amount if the amount was a bit higher. But sometimes it just seemed so random that I couldn't figure out why it was not working. But thankfully, I had Alipay as backup. So I think I never had to use cash when I was there last time.
I did use some cash, but only for buying like bottles of water in small shops, that kind of thing. So
yeah,
like Manfred, I've got some cash, which is a kind of emergency backup that already looks, I probably ought to be careful. I probably should iron it before I go to China again so that it doesn't look quite as used, so that I've got a chance that somebody would accept it at least. So it looks a bit newer. But I think that the other obvious outer sign of digital payments are things like QR codes as well, which for me at least, I mean, I knew of the existence of QR codes, but I'd never actually seen one being used in a practical application except in China, until the pandemic came. And then, of course, in Europe, they suddenly came back into vogue, but they seem to have disappeared quite a lot again. When I think about China, I'm always thinking that people pay in restaurants, especially with QR codes, right? And whereas almost everybody that I know here has some kind of inhibitions about scanning a QR code where they're not sure about the link that's behind it. And they're worried it could be, it could just scam them miraculously suck all of the money out of their bank account just by them scanning a QR code. So yeah, I don't know how you see that, because I think it's part of this typical it's part of the typical openness of Chinese, isn't it, to accept new technologies and to go ahead with new things because it just makes life easier.
Yeah, I think that's one part of it. And I think it's also the fact that, like you said, I think we also had QR codes here in Europe earlier on before the pandemic, but people didn't have smartphones yet. So nobody knew what they were supposed to do with those QR codes. They disappeared again. They came back during the pandemic, but they were not really working properly. Like sometimes you could use them in restaurants to open up the menu as a PDF, but either it would take forever to load, or it was not the right file, or there were so many problems with them. At least I experienced so many problems with them, and they didn't really seem that convenient because I could open up the menu, but that was it. I could not order over the app or anything. It was mainly or usually just a PDF file or just a text where I could see the menu. And it didn't seem like something that I would really need because I couldn't really do much with it. Whereas in China, I feel like, first of all, I think they emerged at the right time. They emerged when Alipay and WeChat Pay introduced their payment functions. So people, I think, got used to them from the very beginning when they started using smartphones, when they're starting using payment functions. the QR codes were there. And I think they just got so implemented and so adapted. There was kind of a more natural way maybe to introduce them into everyday life. And then when people noticed how easy they are to use, they started putting them on all sorts of things. And like you said, I find it so fascinating how many interesting use cases we find in China of QR codes that we would never see around here, or maybe we will at some point in the future, but they don't seem to establish themselves too well here in Germany or in Europe. But I really like how they go beyond the payment function, right? How you can use them for all sorts of things, like finding extra information on products in the supermarket, or just when I was now in Shenzhen, there were so many karaoke cabins, so KTV cabins that I have never seen before, basically just boxes, like big boxes that you can enter, like very small rooms. And people were singing karaoke there, either by themselves or with friends. And they were opening and paying for these containers, let's say, by scanning a QR code. Or I really like the example. I don't know if you've seen it a couple of years ago when I think it was a Japanese game creator that advertised one of their games with a QR code made out of drones in the sky in Shanghai.
Mm-hmm.
And people just took out their phones and scanned the code because that's what they do in China, right? I could imagine here people would be thinking, what is that? And what am I supposed to do? And how are they even doing this? But in China, they always find these really creative use cases for it. And I find that really interesting.
Yeah, no, I think it's very interesting. I know that the car park that I use at the airport, their gates open on QR codes now. So, and they've had that for a couple of years. And the one that I sent you the other week, the photo of the hiking, there's a hiking trail quite a new hiking trail close to here, and all of the additional information is on QR codes. But I think that's a little bit different, maybe because it's a very specific use case. I mean, if I'm in a restaurant and they want me to pay something, then scanning a QR code, I'm assuming it's a restaurant kind of associated link, whereas people are quite concerned about the idea that it could be a bad link, aren't they? I know people are surprised because I have 2 on the back of my business cards, and some people don't even take a business card. They just scan the link on the back. And other people, they're like, yeah, I don't like to scan QR codes. So it's interesting. But yeah, I mean, I think Amir mentioned that also it's quite standard in India, because I think at one point, India tried to abolish cash, right, Amir? Which is like a step even further for me. Because, I mean, Germans are quite focused, especially on data protection. Compared even by European standards, I think Germans are quite focused on data protection. Generally, people are much more careful about how their photos could be used, or about having their face appear somewhere in the internet. Okay, not abolished, but demonetization. Having their face appear in the internet on different, like if you're at events and so on, they don't really like that. I mean, in the past, I often had the impression that Chinese people weren't worried about this in any way, shape, or form. But last time I visited, or the couple of visits I made last year, I did feel that Chinese citizens have become much more careful about their data. They're much more, that the data privacy laws that came in have actually raised awareness about this topic. Or did you see any changes when you were in Shenzhen recently?
I'm not sure. I did notice a few changes on site as well, but I think by looking at what has developed or what has evolved during the last few years, we do often assume that China has no data protection, because we have the feeling that people are just giving out their data everywhere and anywhere. But like you just mentioned before, there has been some developments in the last few years. And on the one hand, I think there is also a cultural component to this. So on the one hand, the way that data protection is understood and implemented in China is also one of the foundations for this rapid development in the technology realm, because people, especially in the beginning of all these digital applications, they were thinking way less about their data.
Yeah.
So they were very open to give it out in exchange for the convenience that they were receiving. And it also has this cultural component of the collectivistic society where people are more concerned with the common good than with the individual, where they think it's also these technology applications are an effort to build the culture of trust. Also, when it comes to money, you mentioned that before, that they are using these digital payments that can be easily tracked. And people see that as a first step, as a positive thing, because they think that creates a trustworthy society. And it's not as much about the individual privacy, but it's more about, when they talk about data protection, the first thing is talking about security and trust and building this harmonious society as a fundamental part of the culture. And also in this extremely fast-changing world. So on the one hand, yes, this means that Chinese citizens in general have less problems with disclosing their data and having their data collected. But we can see a big shift since about 2019, when on the one hand, it started with the top-down regulations from the government. So when Chinese citizens started to think more about the fact that companies, especially private companies, are collecting their data and might be exploiting their personal data, they started to complain about certain issues that they were seeing where data was being misused. And in turn, the government started implementing new laws and new regulations like the data security law or the personal information protection law, which is something that is moving a little bit towards the GDPR. But of course, in China, there's a complete different environment for this. So while data is protected, it's still not considered a, let's say, personal right, but it's more like a state asset. So it is protected from private companies or from other countries, but it's still available to the Chinese government and to the Chinese state. So that is something that could be observed in the last few years. And data is still not as strictly regulated as in Europe or Germany. So that's why these platforms and these ecosystems can develop so fast and so well, because there's so much data available. First of all, a very big population, and then a lot of data that can be collected. But I do notice it when I'm talking to Chinese people now, and also younger generations especially, that they are becoming more concerned with what is happening to their data, who is using it, what are they using it for, is it private companies, is it state companies, is it the government? So I feel like they do have more thoughts about this, and they do have more concerns about this. But especially with young people, I'm noticing a little bit of this resignation mindset that we can see in other areas as well, where young people are less optimistic than previous generations. There's a lot of youth unemployment in big cities. They're a bit more laid back and less, let's say, eager to bring things forward compared to their parents' generation. And I think I could also observe this in the data protection realm, where people are saying, I know that my data is being collected and used, but there's nothing I can do about it because that's just the way it is. And that's how everyday life is. It's very digital. And if I want to use these applications, I have to do it. I have to participate. So I think there's these two things. On the one hand, there is more data protection also by law. Yeah. On the other hand, it's still not protected before the government, and people are starting to think more about it, of what is happening there.
Yeah, I know that back in, I'm going to say 2012, 2013, we had for our infant formula, we had on every can an individual QR code sticker that traced the whole, like for the importer, it traced the whole supply chain, every regional wholesaler who'd had that product in their stock. They knew where every can of milk was. And when mothers scanned it, they could see the import data of that batch of infant formula. And it would register them for for a loyalty scheme. And we had to say to them, please make the mothers do like a double opt-in, like an active click to say that they're okay with you keeping their data, because we didn't want to have problems on the European side with data being used unethically, because then, you could really follow that this mother on one day she bought in this little shop here, and on the next day she bought in, or the next week she bought in a big supermarket somewhere else. So it was quite a complex system, and it was quite, I would say it was quite shocking for the European side, or for the German side especially, to see what could be done with that data and how much analysis could be done with that data to help with sales and marketing, of course, ultimately.
And I think that's a big difference in mentality as well, right? Because, I mean, data protection, of course, is a good thing. But I think a lot of people in China kind of value the fact that by using this data, companies can also offer more personalized services.
Yeah.
So some people think, okay, I don't care if they know if I'm shopping in this supermarket or that supermarket, as long as it's convenient for me and they are offering me services and products that are more personalized because they have all this data and they know me as a customer. So I think that's also a different mindset, right? That people actually kind of like that. They like the fact that they are getting this convenience in return.
Yeah. And I remember somebody asking one of the Chinese team, don't mums object if you call them actively and ask them if they stopped using our product? And they were just like, no, our customer service team, they're calling mothers all day, every day, and mums quite like it. They feel like they're getting personal service if they're called to ask if they still like the product and if everything's okay. And, and I think it was unbelievable for Europeans that level of, let's say, proactive customer service would be acceptable to people, and that you would have the data to be able to do it. So yes, data is the new oil. Definitely. And of course, the one topic that really goes hand in hand with data protection is also this question of innovation, or many people see it as being a lack of innovation in China. And I think that in Germany, there's still a kind of perception of copycat China, and that China, especially in the past, had this very much Wild East attitude towards trademarks, and which to some extent I think is a part of the Confucian culture and society, that people don't see it as being cheating, or they don't see it as faking something. They see it as a compliment to want to be as good. But on the other hand, of course, things did happen. These days, I think many people are underestimating just how innovative China is. I don't know how you see that. Maybe you can explain how people perceive innovation in China a little bit versus the way that it is in Germany.
Yeah, I also still hear that a lot, which is surprising me, that some people have understood that China is innovative in many areas now, but there's still people who have this made in China as a bad thing image, definitely. Even though now there's also surveys and indexes that kind of prove how China is becoming innovative. Because, for instance, the Global Innovation Index in 2021, which is ranking countries according to how innovative they are, China ranked 12th, only 2 positions behind Germany in that ranking, which was a big difference to 10 years before, in 2011, when China was in position 29 as opposed to 12 after 10 years. So we can also see that in different areas, where in 2019 they had more patent applications than the US. So they actually ranked first in numbers of patent applications. There's a lot of happening there also on this, let's say, formal side, where we can see that there's these indexes and these patent applications that kind of prove that China is innovative. But of course, in, let's say, so-called Western minds, China is still a big copycat. And there's a huge difference in mindset and mentality when it comes to copying, because while we assume that copying means, or that innovation means to have a brand new product, something that has never ever been seen before.
Yep.
In China, there's this concept that first you imitate and then you invent, or then you innovate. And we can see that also in the school system. People learn a lot by heart in school. They learn to copy a lot. Also, when it comes to Chinese characters, for instance, first they copy a lot. And then when they are perfect at copying, they can improve through learning and creating something of their own. And I've heard this comparison in China, that copying is compared to learning a language, where people say, well, when you learn a new language, you also first copy words, you copy sentences, you copy what the teacher is saying. Then you have these basic skills. And on top of that, after you learn the grammar, you can form your own sentences, you can write your own texts. And that all of that started by copying, because you need to learn first by copying, and then you can do your own thing. And I think that is one perspective, how people see it, that copies are this intermediate step from imitation to innovation. But of course, there's, like you also mentioned, this very thin line between theft and patent copyright infringements and so on, and actually imitating and innovating something. So of course, there has to be some balance there. But in general, in China, people do think that they need to learn from an existing product, and they have to base their innovation on that, as opposed to inventing something from scratch, and rather have this incremental innovation than this disruptive innovation of, I'm just inventing something completely new.
And it's interesting because I think if you look at art students in Europe, then they have a very similar kind of approach to things, right? That you often see art students learning the techniques by visiting galleries and making copies, in the sense of trying their hand at the techniques used by the old masters in museums and the like. But in other aspects of life, it's seen to be something quite negative and not really seen as the way to go forward. I mean, for me, if I look at, I know that if I'm talking with Chinese friends, often if they're talking about technological apps, they won't say the name of the app, even though they know that I'm somebody who knows what the names of the apps are. They'll call it like Chinese Twitter, or they, instead of saying Xiaohongshu, they'll say, or even Red, they'll say Chinese Instagram. They always kind of make that parallel, and I think that in some ways that kind of reinforces the feeling that it's a copy. Whereas I think that a lot of those platforms, they might have been a kind of copy in the beginning, but they've gone way beyond that now in the kind of functionality and the scope of the functionality that they're offering. I don't know, how are you seeing this developing recently?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it goes hand in hand with what we just talked before, with this process of innovation, that first they had the copies, they copied the Western platforms, and then they added functions and developed them in a way that catered to their Chinese audience and what the audience was expecting. And as we also talked about before, the audience is expecting a lot of convenience, is expecting a lot of different functions. So yeah, I do agree. They started as this first copy of a product, of a Western product, but then with different techniques, either combining different products or adding features or removing features, these new platforms were created. And especially WeChat is a really good example for that, for this Chinese innovation process. And I'm not surprised that Chinese people actually still say it's the Chinese WhatsApp or the Chinese Facebook, because I'm always so shocked about how many people have never heard of WeChat here in Europe, in Germany. Like, I mean, yes, of course, they're not really focusing on China as much, many of them, but I would expect them to at least have heard of what
Yes.
WeChat is. But it's surprising how many don't know, right?
Yeah, it's really surprising how many don't know. I mean, okay, in our circles, then people know, because
Sure.
people are involved either in international business or they're directly involved in China, and then people tend to know. but like you say, amongst the general population, I
Yeah.
think it's become more frequent that people have heard of it, but it's still, that would be the only one that people have heard of.
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
That and of course Douyin, but that's more for reasons of US politics
Yeah.
rather than the app in China. They know about TikTok rather than and that it has a Chinese equivalent. So
Yeah,
yeah.
but I sorry to interrupt you. I just to mention something about WeChat. I think it's really interesting how what you also said, that WeChat has developed into this super app and this platform that has so many more functions as opposed to WhatsApp or Facebook or whatever it was that it was copying in the beginning. And I think it's interesting how now things are changing in the way that now Meta, so let's say Facebook and WhatsApp, are starting to try to copy WeChat, and they are really slow in doing that. They are really trying to copy functions and introducing them, but it's very hard for them to actually have them become successful in the so-called Western world.
And I guess also China has the advantage that they have such a massive sample data set to test with people, that if they want to roll out, I mean, not every WeChat feature has been a great success, but they can roll things out fairly quickly. And if it doesn't work, okay, they kill it and bring something new. And they have enough people who are enrolled in the app and who are actually active and who will actively enjoy to try something new, like we mentioned right at the beginning. And so they can test things, can't they? It's
Yes, and of course they, like you said, they have this advantage of this really big population and very open-minded population who is really trying and adapting and adopting things.
yeah, that's true. And it's yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how things move forward, especially with like the geopolitical situation, and of course people being worried about data going to and fro. And of course you're not allowed to take personal, you're not allowed as a brand, you're not allowed to export any personalized data out of China either, which I think people, brands are often quite surprised about when they realize, not that they actually need it, because do they need to know that Mrs. Wu in I don't know, in Xi'an bought the blue version of a shirt instead of the yellow version? No, it's enough to know that somebody in Xi'an bought a blue shirt. But yeah, it can be quite interesting. And like Amir mentioned, then with AI research, then there are a lot of people like Kai-Fu Lee who are really driving things forward in AI in the Chinese space, even if things are often developing in a kind of parallel way to the outside world, as it were. It's still quite a walled garden.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, we've talked about QR codes, we've talked about data protection, and we've also talked about payments a lot. Maybe we can go a little bit into how digitalization has changed the retail environment. We've also talked about having QR codes on packages to give additional information on products. But I think that there's also more to it than that, isn't there? If you look at the Hema supermarkets or so on, there's a lot more going on in the foreground and in the background as to what makes technical innovation in China in retail.
Yeah, I think one thing that we can also observe in China is that online shopping started directly on mobile in China. It was what we talked about before as well, that they didn't have the stage of desktop computers and online shopping on websites. So they started on mobile. And that is something that can really be observed in the way that retail has developed, that this online offline integration is so strong in China because people started online shopping on smartphones, and now shops are becoming these places of experience, these places where they can integrate with QR codes. The example of the Hema supermarket, which you also brought in, that people have the online shopping experience, but then they also have the offline shopping experience, and the two can be combined really well with the digital payment with the QR codes, with the extra information about supply chains or about different products that they can find. And I think it was specifically these tech giants like Alibaba that really moved retail further in China to this, basically the future of retail that we can see there now, this new retail, as it is called. Because Alibaba, for instance, also introduced the live streaming function, right? Like Taobao Live in 2015, 2016, when people started to buy things on live streams, which was such a long time ago. And we just tried this out during the pandemic. It didn't really work out in Europe, but in China, it completely boomed. So people buy everything in live streams. I find it so fascinating how many examples you can see of Via, the shopping queen of China, who can sell anything from instant noodles up to, I don't know, apartments or like a rocket start. I think she had someone who paid, I don't remember how much, like €1 million or more, to be able to design a rocket for a commercial rocket ship start. So anything can be bought in China in live streams. And this is also part of this new retail where, again, we have these customers who are open to so many things. And then we have the companies that are actually introducing new functions. And that I think one of the most interesting things is this integrated customer journey in China, that you have these platforms, these ecosystems that people don't have to leave when they purchase something. So from the recommendation of a friend to buy something up to the part where they pay for the product and they get it delivered, they stay in one app or on one platform and they don't have to leave. So you don't have this interruption in the customer journey. Yep. Whereas here in Europe, we can still see maybe a friend is recommending you something on WhatsApp. Then you would go to Google and try to find the product. Maybe you find it on Amazon. Then you order it. You have to pay with, let's say, PayPal. And that you've had all these different platforms only to buy one product.
And it only arrives in 10 days.
Yeah, exactly. And in China, exactly, you have this China speed. So first you have this one platform where you do everything, and then you get it delivered really fast. So I think that is one of the big changes in retail, in new retail in China that is coming with this digitalization and the new technologies.
Yeah, and I think that this is a way that China is also becoming a major influencer in the region. Because if I look at the way that live streams and this kind of integrated shopping experience is booming in Vietnam and Indonesia now, then you can see that this is also something that's been taken over, even though those countries are not, they're not always fans of everything that China does. But you know, when it comes to edutainment and shopping, then you know they see that this is the way to go. And especially the pandemic, of course, kickstarted a massive tsunami of live streaming opportunities, even though, for example, in Indonesia, the government is like pushing back against it to try and stop people getting addicted to shopping. So they kind of have made some laws to stop you being able to live stream, and they've made it much harder, let's say, for you to live stream and shop in the moment. They banned TikTok Shop, for example. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's quite interesting the way that things are going, and also all the automatization that's going and the robots that are appearing in the back end with refilling shelves and managing stock and all of those kind of things that are essential for retail to actually work, or even drone deliveries or autonomous vehicles making deliveries within Shanghai, right? That it's quite fun to watch.
Yes, I actually did try the drone delivery in Shenzhen. I don't know if you tried it.
No, not yet.
If you have the Meituan app, you can, it's I think in the Talent Park in Shenzhen. You just go there and there's this one area where they have the Meituan drone delivery boxes, containers. Yep. You have the option to scan the QR code. You can choose, it's a very limited amount of beverages you can choose from, but you can choose a bubble tea, iced tea, whatever. You order it in the Meituan app, and then you wait and see how the drone comes and delivers your bubble tea. And it's a really interesting experience, even though, of course, you would ask yourself, is it necessary to have my bubble tea delivered by drone as opposed to buying it in a shop, where it also it takes longer for the drone to actually deliver it than if you would order it in the normal Meituan delivery app. But it's interesting to see that this is just tested out in the wild. Let's say people can just use it, even foreigners can use it, if they have the Meituan app and the Chinese phone number. And and you can just think about the possibilities that come out of that. If you're testing this and you see how this works, you can use it for more, let's say, useful things than just a bubble tea delivery.
Yes, for sure. And it's going to be really interesting to see how this evolves also in the field of things like taxis and so on, because I think that there's going to be a lot of interesting developments coming up. I mean, you mentioned live streaming, and I actually had the opportunity to visit several companies who were doing live streaming in Hangzhou last year when I was in China, which was very interesting. Some of them were offering like co-working spaces, so you could book in as a KOC or minor KOL. You could book in for a couple of hours and do your live stream. And one of them was offering like distribution services, so they would do the live streaming for you. James thinks that your bubble tea tasted better with the drone.
It did actually, yes.
So yeah, but I was going to say, it felt for me a little bit like the golden age of live streaming is maybe over, at least for these huge stars, because last year or the last couple of years we've seen Austin Lee kind of kill his career with making a couple of statements that were not very well thought through. Ria, I think, had problems with the tax authorities, didn't she?
Yes, she did.
She's come back a bit, but what do you see as the next frontier in terms of live streaming? Will this be virtual influencers? I mean, at one time I used to see quite a lot IEE, but then she seems to have disappeared off the screens. Or what's the other one? Liu Yuji. There's been a few of them around. Some of them look better than others, but how do you see that going?
I think it's really hard to predict whether they will actually become so famous or so well established as the, let's say, human influencers, but for sure people are more open to see them on their screens. And I did see something interesting in December last year about IIE as a virtual influencer. And I think this is something that people will try or companies will try to implement in the future to see if it works out. Which is that IIE actually brought out her own fashion brand. Mm-hmm. So a brand, I don't know if have you heard about this, that they launched this phygital, so this combination of physical and digital fashion brands. And to be honest, I'm not sure how it worked out, because I read that it happened in December, but I have not found a lot, or I haven't heard much about it afterwards. So I'm not sure how successful they were with it. But in any case, they tried it, and they have this streetwear fashion line that they used on virtual avatars. So basically on IIE and similar virtual influencers to show it to the public. And people could order the fashion, the streetwear, the clothes on the apps and in these virtual influencer live streams or videos or whatever they were producing. So I think it's hard to predict if this is actually something that people will like so much that it will become this mass phenomenon. But it's something that we can see so often in China, right? Where things are tried out, and if they don't work, then something new is being tested. But people are quite open to see these things and to try them and to order and to see how it works. And I think this is going to be the next step, where companies will try to do more with these virtual influencers than just use them for presenting products. Make a whole brand out of them with fashion lines and so on and products. And I think the topic of user-generated content is also becoming more popular. And also sometimes in connection to these influencers, there's one virtual influencer, I think his name is Noah, and they kind of based him on feedback from the audience. So they were asking the audience, would you like Noah to be more like this or more like that? And then people decided, voted, and that's how they kind of created this virtual influencer. So I think that is something that we will see more, where the users, the customers will be involved more in the creation process of both these influencers, but also the products.
And of course, from a brand perspective, if you have a virtual brand ambassador, they can't embarrass you with, unless you program it into them, they can't embarrass you with some clumsy political statements, tax problems, having affairs, or any of the other things that influencers have fallen from grace doing.
Tax evasion like Via, right?
Yeah, tax evasion like Via. What was the other thing? A couple of people who've had problems because they've been married to, or because they're married to Koreans, and if China has a political argument with Korea, then their career is over because of Korea. It's all quite sensitive, isn't it? So it's but I think for us in Europe, probably the biggest learning would be we should, whilst it's okay to be careful about about using our data, we should probably be a little bit more open to learning about new things and trying new things, and thinking that in most cases people are not trying to scam us in every case. So
yeah, it's a balance, right? It's a balance that we all have to find between more speed, more development, more technologies, but still, of course, also thinking about the consequences.
yeah, and at the end of the day, the technology is here. We can't put it back in the box and pretend that it didn't happen, because that's also not a realistic opportunity. That's also not a realistic option, is it? So
Definitely.
yeah. So I think we're coming a little bit to the end of our discussions today. I was going to say, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the kind of services that you offer, or who should reach out and connect with you if they've been interested in what we've had to discuss today.
So yes, what I offer mainly is consulting sessions, workshops, presentation on all these things, digital China that we talked about today. On the one hand, for brands and companies to better understand this Chinese digital landscape and the mentality behind it. And on the other hand, for them to gain insights about the key learnings that we can also get for Europe. Because yes, there's a lot of these business models that would not work in Europe based on different factors, or there's a lot of trends that maybe we just don't want to adopt because we just have a different culture, a different mentality. But still, just seeing these things that are developing there and seeing the new innovative trends and future trends is something that is inspiring us to change our business models and to keep up with this fast-paced technological development. So while China also poses a lot of challenges on different levels, we touched upon a couple of topics today as well. There's still so many future digital trends that are developing there, that are increasingly created there, where we move from this made in China to created in China. So yeah, I would say German companies now go to China to innovate, to research. And that is why I am offering these services for them to inform themselves better and to find out what is happening in China and what is also useful for their own business models here in Europe, independently from the fact that they want to expand to China or not. Even if they just have their business models for Europe, for Germany, it's still something that there are still things they can learn from China. So I would be happy to basically hear from anyone who wants to prepare themselves for the digital future that we can already see in China now, and to stay one step ahead of their competition by having this inspiration and these insights of what they could do to innovate.
So not only German companies, but also other companies within Europe, right?
Exactly, yes.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your deep knowledge with us today. It's been a really interesting discussion. And yeah, I hope that it's been interesting for everybody who's listening. Thank you very much for all of those people who've turned up and added comments and added their opinions and ideas into the chat and comment section. It's been very interesting. It's always great to have additional inputs as well and additional ideas that come out of the comments section and the chat. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you to everyone who listened, and I'm looking very much forward to hearing from more people after our discussion.
Exactly. Thanks.